So we often hear about our true nature, about enlightenment being a result of knowing ourselves. We hear about life being an illusion, about not seeing things as they really are. So all of those different ways of describing or those descriptions in teachings are essentially telling us there is another way. And another way from what? It's another way from how we generally experience life. And how would I describe in generic terms how we generally experience life? And I would say we go through life knowing ourselves a certain way, and that way of knowing ourselves dictates that we feel uncomfortable with the variability of life, dictates that we feel uncomfortable with the unpredictability of life, dictates that we feel uncomfortable with the fact that outcomes are not always pleasurable. So the way that human beings evolve, and you might notice I describe it from the point of view of causality and an actual human being that is changing through time. Now, that doesn't mean that that's absolutely how things are, but it appears that way. And so it's valid to talk about it in that context, as long as within that context we're not reinforcing and keeping in place absolutely the components that create that uncomfortableness. And in a way, sometimes talking about life as if it is the way we experience it can do that. It can keep the suffering in place. But hopefully, if I'm conscious of that and the teaching is designed such that it breaks down those obstacles, then there'll be a positive effect, a change. So teachings are really telling us that it's very normal to feel uncomfortable in life, and there is another way that can change. And they tell us that it can change by telling us, we've forgotten ourselves and therefore we experience life a certain way. If we remember ourselves, we will experience life differently. Essentially, it's saying there is hope for change. Now, it's important for us not to hear that and get attached to life being essentially more perfect than it is, meaning let's not turn that into an expectation. I expect change to happen. I expect my experience of life to be better. If that's the attitude we have towards hearing that the experience of life can change, then what's happened is we've heard information and we've turned it into an expectation. We've turned it into something I feel I need in order for life to be okay. And if life is not like that, then it won't be okay. And so if that becomes the relationship, if that is the attitude towards that statement, then the likelihood is that statement will become the basis of suffering. And so that's why some teachings choose not to use certain statements, choose not to use certain ways of describing life, because there is an awareness within the teacher and the teaching that if I describe it that way, the human structure as it currently exists is bound to interact with it in a way that creates suffering. So that's why these explanations are here, so that if that's what's happening, maybe at some point the explanation is heard. I might have said it many times, you might have listened to many satsangs, and it mightn't have been heard. And today, for example, it might be heard that it's important to know that there is another way. And that's why it's said, right? There is a potentiality for humans to live free of suffering. What is being described as continuous, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. It's important to know that. If we don't hear that, if we don't know that, then a movement towards that, hopefully in a healthy way, won't happen. If we hear it, we say yes, something inside of us says yes, this is important. And once that alchemy happens, then the process starts. So if you're feeling uncomfortable, it's not to deny it, but know it is a feeling, and that there is a potentiality for that feeling of uncomfortableness to subside. And we could call that the natural state. It's called a natural state, one, because the describing as a natural state sort of implies what we really are. It implies something more real. It implies authenticity. It implies pureness. And then the suffering can be, we can start to relate to it as an add-in, an error, a obstacle, a veil, something that covers up our natural state. So to hear that our natural state is peace can lead to a falling back, a resting. So the natural state is also sometimes described as the depth of who we are, and an analogy of a lake that maybe is rough on the surface from time to time because of the wind, but at the depth of the lake it's still and quiet and untouched by what's happening on the surface. So to hear about the natural state can be part of the change in our up-to-date conditioning that allows us to seek what is already here instead of the movement that the doer and attachment identity is so habituated towards. And that is a seeking of what we don't have. And so, the movement to rest in your own being is so simple once it becomes simple. Until it becomes simple, it can be frustrating. It's like, I don't get it. And the thing is, because there's someone trying to get it as a addition, as a gaining, as a achievement, as a doing, as a intellectual understanding. And what it's pointing at is the opposite. It's about the dissolving of the trying to get it. And, we can hear that, and then we can try to not try. And it's the dissolving of even trying to not try. Completely neutral. And one of the descriptions I would use to explain the dynamic that is in place that forces the experience to feel uncomfortable, which also means there is no space, no distance between the feelings and the thoughts, the pleasures and the pains, and that which is experiencing them. When that's the case, essentially what has happened is an identity that feels very identified with things that are happening to the body, things that are being produced as a result of the body, like thoughts and emotions. Feels very identified with those, which really means it feels like it is them. And that sense that I am my thinking, I am my feeling, the pleasure or the pain that happens to the body and is experienced by the body is happening to me. That creates an identity that essentially knows itself as and experiences itself as separate from everything else in life. And there's a movement that can start to loosen that up. And the movement doesn't necessarily happen. It's not something that you can necessarily get in an instant. There are moments where there is instantaneous change, but those instantaneous changes are usually a result of some work, some effort, some practice that came before. And in the effort, in the practice that comes before, sometimes it feels like it's really not working, like nothing is happening. And then we have a little glimpse. And in hindsight, after some time, that's when there can be a sense, oh, something is changing. And the dynamic that tends to bring about this change is for us to start seeing these movements that we are convinced are who I am as objects. And in order for us to see them as objects, they really need to be described to us in an impersonal way. If something is described impersonally and is seen impersonally, seen to be impersonal, the system simply can't then have the same relationship to it as before, a relationship which said, this is so personal, it's who I am. So that's the dynamic that leads to feeling this uncomfortableness with oneself, which is to be heavily identified and lost in thoughts, in feelings, in the body, identification with the body. And what gets covered up in that state is the formless, is the aspect of ourself that you could say is outside of the flow of life, almost outside of the experience of life. And so how we come to know ourselves is on the gross level, and the subtle is covered up. The gross aspects are on the level of time and space, on the level of the flow of life, and that's where things are always changing, where things don't always go well. Sometimes they go well and sometimes they don't. And so if we only know ourselves on that level, then we're bound to feel uncomfortable, because it's not the whole of who we are. In fact, it covers up, it obscures the essence of who we are. And so to start seeing thoughts as an arising, thoughts as a happening, feelings as an arising in a body-mind organism, emotions as a happening in a body-mind organism. The movements of the body are a happening of a body-mind organism. The speaking is happening. Words are happening. Thinking is happening. Emotions are happening. Everything is a happening according to God's will. What that means is that the thinking is happening not because of Roger. The speaking is happening not because of Roger, but because of what we can call God's will. Now, our understanding of how life works, which really we can call a misunderstanding, is to be absolutely convinced that there is an entity that is who I am, and who I am controls, is in control of, creates the movements of the body, the thoughts the body has, the feelings the body has, the words that the body says. And that is the false sense of self. And the amazing thing is that that sense of self, even though it doesn't exist, it comes into existence as a belief that it exists. And so what exists is a belief. But beliefs, which is a type of thought, have a very unique quality. They have a very strong effect on the experience. So a belief that I am an entity in control of what the body does, in control of what the body says, in control of what the body feels, that belief creates the sense of actually being the body, being the thoughts, being the emotions. And that's the identification that we could call the psychological me. And so the more that we hear that life is a happening according to source, according to God, a happening according to life, everything down to the smallest details in life is all a happening according to something other than the controller, other than the me, the psychological me-doer. The psychological me-doer is a belief that can't possibly be the doer. It is the belief that there is a doer. And that belief then claims ownership and becomes what we call identified with movements that are happening. So within this framework, the body is described as a biological robot, a biological machine. The speaking is happening according to the biological instrument's makeup. And what do I mean by makeup? I mean its structure in each moment, which is always changing, but in any particular moment, if we were to take a snapshot in a particular moment, the biological instrument is a particular way. It's wired, it's structured, it's designed, it's shaped a particular way. And it's in continuous flux, but in each moment it's one way. And in that moment, the output of that biological machine has to be in alignment with its structure in that moment. And the explanation for its structure is it's the body's genes, which essentially you can look at that as the blueprint that gets put in place by nature and grows. And it grows by growing essentially is a word used to describe the forming of the entity according to the blueprint, according to this mystical design, natural design. And the growing of the physical entity doesn't happen in isolation. It doesn't happen in a sterile environment. It happens in this soup of life. And so the growing is intimately affected by everything that happens to the entity moment after moment after moment. From the moment it was conceived, the biological entity, the genetic structure, is one with the environment it's in. And so we can describe it as genes and up-to-date conditioning. And at some point we might even see that that's just a conceptual distinction of genes and up-to-date conditioning. They're not really two, they're one movement. But it's important to be able to describe it as genes and up-to-date conditioning so that something that we haven't seen with any clarity can be conceptualized, and maybe we start to see, oh yes, in each moment I was a result of the genetic blueprint that grew from the time that the sperm and the egg came together and was conditioned, new conditioning coming in through life moment after moment after moment. And the combination of the genes and up-to-date conditioning was my structure in each moment. And life is continually delivering new conditioning that can change our up-to-date conditioning. And that new conditioning, as I said, is not separate from the genetic structure. So really, the whole system is always changing. We can look at the genetic structure as more or less fixed, and the new conditioning is what's changing. But once we see that they're not two, then what we start to see is that the whole system is dynamic. And in science, that's referred to as epigenetics, the fact that your genes are always being influenced by the external environment, and therefore they're never static. So those are the only two factors when we look into it, the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So genes refer to everything, maybe not using the word in the same way that it's used in specifically in medicine for something very specific, but it means, your fingernails, your skin, your hair, the color of your eyes, the shape of your neural network, how strong your muscles have the capacity to become or not, your bones, the whole structure is there because of the genetics. That's how it's being used in this teaching. So there, the genes and up-to-date conditioning are the only two factors that affect the biological instrument. And the speaking is an output of the biological instrument. And it doesn't require someone, it doesn't require a me doer for speaking to happen. If there is a machine that is designed to hear a noise and then start functioning a certain way, all that is required is for the noise to happen. And if the noise happens, the machine then senses the noise. It's designed to sense the noise, and it starts functioning according to its design. And it's our deeply ingrained belief of personal doership that assumes, well, if speaking is happening, there has to be a speaker. And our idea of a speaker means a psychological me doer, a controller of the words. And what I'm suggesting is the words come out exactly according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. It's no surprise that if you didn't grow up in a situation where you were conditioned to learn Japanese, for example, if life didn't deliver new conditioning such that the Japanese language was learned, then it's no surprise that we don't speak Japanese. We function according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And this concept is not complicated, but it can sometimes be, there's a barrier to allow it to land, and that barrier is this psychological me, which is a belief. And the belief can sometimes prevent the system from hearing or understanding what is being said. It's like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? Genes and up-to-date conditioning. Everything is happening. The speakings are happening according to genes and up-to-date conditioning. And go, yeah, that's me. I am the human being. And when we say I without this understanding, what we're really saying is I as the controller, rather than I as the after effect. So when I speak about Roger, I'm really talking about Roger, the sense of being. It's an after effect. It's an output. And so the speaking is registered as a happening after it happens, knowing that if the biological instrument didn't have a specific set of up-to-date conditioning, the speaking would happen very differently. There's no way I could talk about certain topics if I grew up in a completely different situation with different conditioning. So every time I pick up a book and I read something, that's new conditioning. Every time I find myself listening to parents or teachers or being in a particular society, that's new conditioning coming in. And we don't control the new conditioning that is coming in. And so what that means is that the human being is not in control of how it is in each moment. It is it is as it is. Now, why is this important? It's important for two reasons. One, as I said, that if we start seeing the thinking, especially the thinking, as an output of a machine, what can happen is that thoughts become seen as objects. And identification with thought is the absence of seeing thoughts as objects. Identification with thoughts is seeing a thought as being the subject, being what I am. Now, if you see a thought as an object, then we must say, well, what is aware of that object? And not only do we ask what is aware of the object, but by default, the fact that the thought has been seen as an object means now a separation of a good sort. It's ironic that identification, which is grabbing onto objects, so a psychological belief and attachment to the body, to thoughts, to emotions, to feelings, that attachment creates the sense of being separate in the world. And the letting go when it happens, the change where the attachment to objects is not there, creates what we can call a separation that creates a recognition of our oneness with life. And when thoughts are witnessed as objects arising, when feelings are witnessed as objects arising, their grip is lost. The grip they have on us is lost, which means there is a sense of spaciousness, a sense of not being drowned or lost in that feeling. And that is the beginning of coming to know the essence of who we are, what you can call your true nature. And from that witnessing perspective, it might become apparent that the thoughts are not happening outside of me, but rather they're arising within that which is aware of them. And as we play with that notion, which really becomes more and more evident as we become quieter and quieter and just allow the faculty of awareness to be, then we might actually get a sense that not only do the thoughts arise within awareness, but actually the objects in the world are also known within this same field of awareness. And we might notice that the body is an object awared in this field of awareness. Now, this isn't something to try and make happen when you want it to happen. If you set out to make witnessing happen, the very movement that says, oh, I'm going to do this now, I'm going to put all of my effort into witnessing thoughts as are happening. That very movement is the the counterproductive measure to that happening. So these words are new conditioning, and they're not intended as a set of prescriptions. Rather, they are maybe descriptions of something that might happen. What I mean by that is you might be walking down the street and you might notice a commentary of thinking. And maybe for the first time, the thinking is seen from a distance or seen as an object actually seen, registered. Oh, there is thought. And that would mean it just in that moment happened. So the belief in personal doership is continually, even though the talks keep saying there is no doer, the belief says, oh, I heard Roger talk about seeing thoughts as objects, and he must have been talking to me, telling me to do it. So there is no doer. There is no one to do it. So you might say, so why are you saying any of it at all? Because the way life works is that the body is a biological instrument that is shaped by its genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so these talks are just new conditioning that may or may not affect how that body functions. And so it may be that the new conditioning is received by a body-mind instrument such that one day while walking down the street, it happens that the thoughts are seen as an object, that they are witnessed as an object, and that the body may also appear within that awareness that has seen the thought as an object. And the body might also be seen as an object. And it truly has to be a happening. It can't possibly be your doing, because there is no doer, just the belief that there's a doer. And what keeps the belief of doership in play is this this very friendly to the doership idea, which is my completeness, my happiness will be found in outcomes. And so then the doer and this attachment to outcomes feed themselves in a feedback loop where the doer says, well, I need the outcome, so I better get to it. I better make the outcome happen. I better make life happen. And so along with the teachings that say life is a happening, thoughts happen, the body functions, speaking happens, we're also told that our happiness, what we're really looking for, which is not happiness through pleasure, but happiness in the form of continuous unbroken peace of mind, is not to be found in outcomes. It doesn't require us to achieve a particular life appearance. In fact, as I've pointed out, the idea that my happiness is to be found in outcomes reinforces the doing, which reinforces the belief, which covers up the simple essence of awareness. So a healthy movement might well be, and you can't fake this, but at some point there can be an utter frustration with trying to make this change happen, with seeking. And that utter frustration can seem like bad news. Who likes frustration? In fact, it could be part of a real seeing. I simply cannot make this happen. I don't have the skills, the capacity to make anything in life happen. Life is a happening. I am being lived. What that means is that the body is moving according to life. Life has shaped it. Life is living the body. So whenever you feel compelled, notice that compulsion as a happening. So whenever you feel compelled to just rest, to just stop, the thought may arise, actually my thinking that is going at 100 miles an hour, telling me what I need life to look like, what I need to achieve. If that stops, we're not really losing or missing out on anything. We can appreciate that if it starts to dawn on us that that is our misunderstanding, that is the false sense of self, that is the psychological identity, which is just a deeply set of ingrained beliefs playing on themselves, forcing us to think a certain way. And as we start to get a glimpse that all that thinking is taking us in the wrong direction, then a stopping is no longer seen as a missing out or a regretful thing. You know, if you're trying to get somewhere in a hurry and you find yourself stuck behind traffic or stuck at a red light, then it's seen as regrettable or unfortunate. It's like, especially if you're in a hurry, it's seen as an obstacle. And so when we're convinced that we need to get somewhere in life in order to feel fulfilled, then the thinking seems like it's a very helpful thing. And if anything interrupts that thinking, it's seen as regrettable. It's like seen, I'm sorry, I can't spare the time to stop thinking because that will just get in the way of me getting where I need to go. And as we start to see that that is the fallacy, then the thought, stop and be, or the thought, I am, which is reminding us, I already am. I'm already where I need to be. And that any movement outward in the form of guilt or blame, pride, worry, or expectation, and so especially expectation, trying to control and achieve things according to my timetable, my expectations, then that can start to get cut off. So whenever you feel like sitting, stopping, and the stopping isn't necessarily about a physical stopping. The body can keep walking, it can keep driving, it can keep talking for that matter. And the psychological narrative can just stop, or there can be the psychological narrative carrying on and a stopping, what we call stopping or a disconnecting from that, and just a watching that as a happening. And so once again, this is not an instruction for you, but a description of something that might happen according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning. An up-to-date conditioning that has been, or that includes hearing this set of descriptions. It's such a relief to realize that life has always been living us. That when the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes falls away, a misunderstanding can assume, oh, well, then in that case, we won't do anything. We'll just sit on the couch like a blob. What's the point? That's what the misunderstanding might assume. But the understanding of non-doership is the recognition that we have always been functioning according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the falling away of the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes is the falling away of just a small part, the problematic part of our up-to-date conditioning. And the human body will always be a conditioned instrument. Thankfully, I mean, if we prayed for our conditioning to be removed in totality, we would, and our wish was granted, we then wouldn't be able to move or speak or think, because so much of the functionality is dependent on our up-to-date conditioning. And so the doership and attachment to outcome is just the psychological conditioning. And so when that dissolves, the body still feels hungry and the movement towards the fridge happens. And that's when it's seen, oh, that was always a biological movement. And the psychological me simply claimed ownership over all of that. The psychological me is our attitude to what is happening. And it's an attitude of doership and attachment which says, oh, I shouldn't have acted that way. I should have acted perfectly. You shouldn't have acted that way. You should have acted perfectly. And if we go to the description I was giving, is everyone is acting exactly according to their design. There's no question of acting differently. We might find ourselves acting differently in a similar situation next time compared to this time, because this time we functioned according to genes and up-to-date conditioning, and then the result of that functioning is essentially new conditioning, and we might learn, which really means the body-mind organism is receives new conditioning, which changes its up-to-date conditioning, which means it may function differently next time, but it may not function differently. We're not in control of how that experience affects our up-to-date conditioning. So we'll take some questions. I think we'll take 3 or 4 questions. Hi, Holger.
Thank you, Roger, brother Roger. At the beginning of the satsang, an old song came to mind. It said "Personal Jesus" was the title
Uh-huh.
on Depeche Mode, and I'm really. It's so beautiful how skillful you make it so simple. It's unbelievable. It's so sweet, and I'm deeply grateful for your satsangs and your conditioning. And there's so much working inside I have no clue about, but there's so much. I'm just grateful. It's wonderful, and it's so simple. It's unbelievable. I mean, how can you make it so simple? It's beautiful. It blows my mind.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Holger. That's very nice of you to say. Mm-hmm. I'm glad to hear
Thank you. And
I'm glad to hear this is the effect. I really trust that it has to make a difference. We might not realize how it's affecting us, but if we're drawn to listen out of something genuine, if it really feels like I feel like listening, it means that the body is ready to receive it as food, in a sense, as something nourishing. And the change, I have a lot of faith in these processes.
and is it okay to say that being is sweet?
Why not? Yeah.
Good. Because before I was always so stuck in the pairs of opposites, I didn't want to make a statement.
Mm-hmm.
But saying that being my natural state is a sweetness totally resonates. I mean,
You know why we tend to not like, and in fact we're discouraged within certain teaching modes. Sometimes we're discouraged of claiming or putting a characteristic onto anything, a characteristic that has its opposite. The reason that we're discouraged is because we tend to be polarized in life towards the things that are good and that we like, and so those things we gravitate towards with a craving and a desire, and those things that are bad or that we don't like, we tend to push away. And so if we label something as nice or good, the automatic tendency is to find ourselves identified with it, attached to it, and there isn't a freedom in that. And so we're often encouraged to just allow everything to just be as it is and don't put any labels on it. And that's why we're encouraged not to put labels on it, because we have this tendency that as soon as we label something as good or bad, we'll either crave it or avert it. And if we can start to see our labels as being just descriptions, where we remind ourselves it's just a description of what is, rather than something to get attached to, then there's the potential for us to start being able to reintroduce labeling in a way that we find is not problematic. And then that's when we realize, the labeling was never the problem. It was our relationship to our labeling of the whole, which includes the interconnected opposites. So the whole includes sweet and sour. And what has happened is when we call something sweet, we say, oh, I like that, but I don't like the sour parts. And so we divide the whole into the bit that is acceptable and valid to us attitudinally, and the bit that is unacceptable and invalid to us. And so what we've done is we've broken the whole asunder. We've invalidated part of the whole, we've torn it, but we can't actually tear the whole. So it's a psychological relationship to the whole which is out of line with the whole. And if we can start to label the sweet and the sour and say, yes, that part is the sweet and that part is the sour, and yet I see that they are both interconnected opposites, part of the whole, and both valid, then our labeling capacity, our labeling faculty becomes exactly that. It becomes a faculty. And so this is why I say, look, if someone is doing something stupid, right, I can call it stupid. I do lots of stupid things. Now, when I call that a stupid action, an irresponsible action, let's say, it's a description of what the body-mind organism is functioning as. And my attitude is not to say, hey, you as a separate doer are being stupid. Now, that's fine for me because I guess there's been a whole process that has broken this identification of firstly doership and then attachment to things not being done stupidly. And so you might get a sense, people listening might get a sense, is as soon as you call something good or bad or stupid or intelligent, there's a judgment inside the label. And the judgment has to do with, when we look at it, doership. You, the doer, could be different and you're acting this way. And secondly, there's this attachment to life being perfect, 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 or pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And so as soon as we label, it's a judgmental labeling. And so as we learn to change from judgmental to discernment, and discernment is just calling a spade, means if you smell a rose and it smells wonderful, we can say that is a wonderful smelling rose. And if we find ourselves with a sense of judgment whenever we label things, then it might be good for a while to stop the labeling, and we find, oh, as soon as I stop the labeling, the judging falls away. We just say, actually, it's neither clever or stupid, it just is. Right? Now, on the one hand, that's correct. It is what it is. And from a practical point of view, we can say something is clever or stupid. If we're forced to judge when we call it clever or stupid, then the teachings say, hey, stop labeling and just relate to it as it is what it is. And once that has happened, then we realize, oh, actually, I have to call a spade as part of functional daily living. And it's the judgment in it, it's the attachment in it, it's the doership in it that causes the problem, not the labeling in and of itself.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you.
Thank you, Holger. It's a good topic, so I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, I was kind of stuck in labeling. In trying to find myself in labels.
Mm-hmm.
Beautifully explained. Thank you. I step away. There are other people waiting.
Okay.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Holger. Hi, Martin.
Hello there, Roger.
Hi, Martin.
Thanks for doing this.
You're welcome.
Just everything you say, Roger, just lands with me. If you, but yeah, I get it. I absolutely get it. This thing about there being no distance between my true nature and what's happening,
Mm-hmm.
with thoughts or. Perhaps I can give you a couple of examples, and then I can ask you a question. I went to sleep the other night thinking about a really dear friend of mine who owned an Italian restaurant in Bristol. Actually, I went in there a few years ago with my oldest son to be told that he had died the week before. And I was thinking about Tony as I went to sleep. And when I woke up, I was actually dreaming about me running his restaurant, which is a bit strange. I have run a wine bar before, and I woke up in the most awful fear that I couldn't actually run this restaurant. And it was a real, it reminded me of the feeling I got walking to school as a 6-year-old boy on my own, thinking, what the hell's going to happen? The fear was absolutely gripping. Mm-hmm. And I suddenly realized, how can, this is just happening. I've not made this happen. I was dreaming. It wasn't real. But this fear that I've woken up in was real. Quite extraordinary.
Mm.
And it took me about 5 or 10 minutes to really sort it out, that this was a happening based on a dream.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so that's one thing. And the other evening, I was driving up to a local village in my little car, up a little country lane, and I drive pretty slowly because there's only room for one car. It's a single track road.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly I saw some headlights in front of me, and this car came round this bend really fast, and all the brakes went on, and you could see the car skidding. And I thought I was just waiting for the bang. I thought, oh my God. And he actually put it into the hedge, and the hedge stopped it.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought, before I would have had a really massive reaction to that. He did reverse up the road and let me putt, but I would have stopped the car, got out and said, you stupid, why are you? And I didn't. I just thought, it's just a happening. Mm-hmm. Like you were saying, it was. So all I can say to you is you've completely changed my life, my attitude to life.
Mm.
But completely. But something you just said earlier really resonated with me, is I am not the doer. I can see that now. All the things that happen and what I do and what I say is not of my volition. It just happens.
Mm-hmm.
The words just come out of my mouth.
Mm-hmm.
I get up and I make a cup of tea, or I go to the loo. I don't think about, I'm not the doer. But I've now got this where I don't know what to do because I'm not the doer. And I think I've talked to you about this before and asked you before. And I do follow your advice saying, yeah, I walk up the road. Yeah, this is just God's will unfolding. This is my destiny. You're doing exactly what you should be doing, feeling the way you do. Think, those thoughts are occurring.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this real frustration. I don't know how to live life, Roger.
Okay, so we can say, okay, life is a happening, or another way of saying it, everything that happens is predetermined, or everything that happens is a happening according to God's will. And so Ramesh used to say a valid question could be, well, if everything is a happening according to God's will, how should I live my life? He said that's a valid question. And he said, I've got a very simple answer to you. In each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do, knowing that what you think or feel to do is part of being lived, meaning in that moment that's a happening according to God's will, and that whatever you do or don't do after thinking or feeling it is exactly what is destined to happen, and that the outcome is also what is destined to happen. And so that means that that's a very simple answer to the question, how should I live my life? And he said, you have to just do in each moment what you think or feel to do, which really, when we look at it, is not you doing it, but that's how life happens. And if there is a sense of indecisiveness or a sense of not being able to feel what to do, you just sort of say, well, I don't have any clear direction. Then hopefully the attitude is, oh, that too is God's will. That too is a happening. So, we might be attached to life flowing, to I being able to know what I think I should do or what I feel to do. And the fact is that it's all happening according to God's will, and God throws in periods where we have no idea what to do next. And so that means that there might be an uncomfortable feeling in that, and that's God's will. And hopefully your attitude can reconcile with, oh, even that is not my doing. There is no doer to do anything. There's life happening. So another way of phrasing it, because I've said in each moment, because it's answering the question, how should I live my life, which is a practical question, and the practical answer is in each moment, do what you think or feel like doing. The other way of describing that is you don't live your life, you are being lived, and you are being lived by the fact that the body has its genes and up-to-date conditioning, and life or the body in a particular situation will move or not move only one way, and that could include feeling stuck. So essentially, the overriding attitude we have to have is it's all a happening, and in practical terms, the happening unfolds by the human being in each moment doing exactly what they think or feel to do. Simple.
Because there is this overriding, I'm not doing, I've missed something here. And I haven't missed anything.
No, it's
I've not missed anything.
That's right. It's our destiny not to know, not to feel like, not to have clarity sometimes.
That's right.
So you don't
It's
even...
just a happening, isn't it?
That's it. You don't even need to fix that.
There's nothing to fix, is there, Roger?
No,
there isn't anything to fix.
That's it.
And we're just surrounded in a world where people are trying to fix everything, whether it be politicians or doctors or scientists, or they're all trying to fix what is already perfect.
Yes, or at least already happening. I can't emphasize enough that the attitude of humanity is of doership and attachment to outcomes, and our attitude is has been of doership and attachment to outcomes, and this movement is weakening it. And if we find ourselves perpetually exposing ourselves as, or if our destiny exposes ourselves to the mainstream in big doses, it is quite possibly detrimental to our process. Now that's our destiny, right? If that's happening. But the new conditioning that I'm putting out here is that if we do turn off the TV, if we do stop listening and engaging in what people are saying, understanding it's all coming from the wrong, or at least the attitude that leads to suffering. If we turn off, that allows the weakening of that doership in us to happen in a more effective way. If we're continually immersing ourselves in this attitude of everyone around us that says, of course you need to get somewhere, of course you need to fix it, and of course the world is going to crap and it's their fault and it should be this way. If we're immersed in that narrative, we're creatures of habit and we're creatures of learning from our environment, and so it can keep us in a rut. So turn off as much external sound that reinforces doership and attachment to outcome as much as you can.
Get that, Roger. I think it's very good advice, and that's what I do. It's quite extraordinary. That I might have said it to you before, but I do realise I've always been trying to, that people are always sort of as a square peg trying to get up in the morning, but that's okay. I do realise that it's my destiny to be doing what I'm doing, talking to you now and understanding this new attitude, completely different attitude to who I am and how I operate, how the world operates. So thank you very much, Roger. I can't ever thank you enough.
That's nice to hear
I
your
can't ever
feedback.
thank you enough.
Nice to hear that it's having an effect, Martin. Well done. Hi, Himalika.
Sure. Hope you're doing good.
Yes, I am. Thank you.
So, recently I'm dealing with this thing in my life where actually my dad is alcoholic and abusive, and at times it has escalated at that point that I had to call the police several times at my home. That much. So even knowing that it is all God's will and it's happening because it is written in my destiny. It would happen the way it is. Still, there's too much suffering, too much non-acceptance, and too much questioning why I was born even, and why I have to suffer this much. And I recently I asked my friend a question: what would Roger sir would have done if he had been in my situation? Would he had left the home, lived alone, left everyone? I don't know what to do next. There's no answer. There's no questions already, because as it's happening, as it was written in my destiny, but still there's suffering, and there's no way out.
Well, Nisargadatta was asked, what would you do if someone came into the room with a knife? And the most truthful answer is, I don't know. I don't know what I would do. I don't know what I would do in any situation. Each situation has got so many unique variables. And so that, that answer, I don't know. What we can see is how it unfolds. If you ask me what I would have done or what I would do in that situation, my tendency is to move away from suffering or things that create, trigger an attitude of suffering. Now, that's not always possible. My tendency has been to say, actually, suffering is not what I want in life. So I'm going to do the best to move away from those things. Now that's definitely not telling you what you should do, because I don't know. I don't even know what I really would do. I'm just saying my tendency has been to move away from things that trigger suffering. So I'm not telling you that you should move away, because that would be saying, I know what your destiny is, and we can't know what your destiny is. But it's very valid to consider your options and say, really, if I let go of my shoulds and shouldn'ts, and I really open up to the options available to me, is there an option available? And hopefully there might be a seeing, yes, I can do this, and I don't need to resent the person for making this happen. But rather you see it's my choice, given the circumstance, to move away, and I understand that they can't have functioned differently. And similarly, if you can't, because of circumstance or because of fear, move away, then hopefully there is a seeing that, yes, there is fear, there is a fear of leaving even, or especially a fear of leaving, and that's what is keeping me in this situation, and that's destiny. I wish I had a different explanation, but the truth is that what I'm calling destiny is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, and that pleasure and pain can be extreme. So it's not there to it's not there as a sugar coating. It's simply an explanation that says life will unfold, it will be pleasure or pain, and depending on our attitude to the pleasure or pain, there will be suffering or peace of mind.
So this suffering acts like a messenger or something. I don't know.
For the right person, yes, indeed. If suffering is there, it can be a sign that either for us to look at the attitude or to look at the situation and say, well, maybe it's not just about saying, happiness can exist in any situation, because if we are staying in a situation because of an attachment to outcomes, it's not possible to be happy in that situation because we're staying in that situation because of attachment to outcomes. So at some point, the suffering can go beyond getting us to look at the attitude and ask whether we are staying in the situation because of a set of shoulds and shouldn'ts, or attachment to outcome.
This one who's like analyzing suffering, and that person seems at peace very much. Observing suffering, observing hurt, observing, I don't know.
Say it again. I missed the first part.
Okay, so who is this person who can observe this suffering?
Mm-hmm.
Are there two people?
Well, yeah,
One who's observing.
Indeed, there are layers to the human being. And so one layer of the human being can be aware of another functioning of the human being. And at often humans are not designed to be able to be aware of their different layers. And so there is an enmeshment of all the layers. And as we start to witness life as a happening, start to maybe keep looking at thoughts as they're described as objects arising based on the circumstance and our genes and up-to-date conditioning, then what starts to develop is this capacity to see layers of ourself as, so one part of the human can see another part of the human, and then there is what feels like a separation of those parts, and that creates a space, and it creates a capacity to be at peace even when another part of our system is functioning either in biological pain or even in psychological suffering. As long as there is a witnessing of either the biological pain or the suffering, then there is a much bigger degree of peace than if that witnessing is heavily identified with and not seeing those movements from a distance.
Right.
So good luck.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, all the best.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll take this as the last question. Hello, Abhimanyu. Hello.
Hi, Roger. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, Roger. I'd like to thank you once again for these satsangs. I can't tell you how much they have an impact.
Oh, great. You're very welcome.
And my question to you is, you've said this already in the talk before, and it sometimes so happens that whenever I have certain questions, that's already been explained in the talk. My question now is that, like you said, that there'll be times that you might be walking. So this happened to me while driving, and I realized that, yes, that is a thought, and I'm seeing that thought as an object, but that just lasts for a second or two, and I'm pulled back into my old life, old way of living. And I'm just waiting for awareness to happen, for me to be able to feel the being. And it becomes very, very frustrating when it doesn't happen. Somewhere, it's also with my old conditioning where a lot of close ones have told me that maybe I'm not living up to my potential. And I try to be lazy or take life easy. But I just go ahead with the understanding, the intellectual understanding so far, and tell myself that probably it's not yet my destiny, or it's just God's will, that it's not happening on a consistently longer basis. But there's a longing for that to happen and to find that sense of peace.
Yeah. So what you say is very interesting, and you've also described the right attitude, as far as I would say, is that seeing, yes, it obviously isn't my destiny at the moment, and in the wrong context, rightfully so, other teachings sometimes, or people will come in and say, that's a terrible attitude to have. It's just going to make you complacent. It's just going to make you satisfied with, less than. But in the right context, that is an amazing attitude to have. If you are looking at it while being guided by a teaching and having the capacity, which I can sense you have, to be able to hear the teaching as it's being said, as it's intended, then this attitude, it won't be understood by most people. If they hear you saying, well, these things are unfolding at their own pace and I'm just going to wait, I'm going to sit back, they're going to be hearing that from their doership point of view that says, no, that's terrible. How are you going to get to where you need to go if you just sit back? So I wouldn't put too much weight on that feedback from people, especially if it's clear that they're not immersed in this change or in this attitude to life. And if you can see the fact that you're getting little glimpses, the little glimpses are because a certain muscle is getting stronger and another muscle is getting weaker. And if you can look at it as if you are strengthening muscles, and if you've had a stroke, for example, it takes time for the nerves to regenerate and for you to get motion back. And so just a little bit of motion in the leg, if you compare that to full function, you might feel frustrated and say, I just have a little motion and it's not enough compared to full function. But if you can look at it as a movement towards full function, then a little movement and a little bit more movement, and it all builds on itself, is actually fantastic. And so it's a different two attitudes. You either have the attitude that says it's a little movement and comparing it to full mobility, it's not good enough. Or you can say this is a great movement towards full mobility. And so that's what I would encourage as we see, as this new perspective comes in, then more and more insights will start to make more and more sense. And that's a snowballing of the process, because as a particular insight clicks, what we'll find is that this witnessing or this seeing thoughts as objects will happen in a more prolonged manner, a more stabilized manner. And in some of the explanations I've used when I've described the practice of abiding in I am, which is whenever you remember and find yourself in blame or shame or pride or expectations, the thought I am might arise that can cut off the suffering just for a moment, and we drop into being, which is the gap essentially in between the thoughts that has been created by this thought I am, which is essentially just embedded in that reminder that has arisen. There is the understanding actually what my true nature already exists. It's covered up by this thinking, let me just be. And in that process, we might find ourselves dropping into being just for half a second, and then we're dragged back out into thinking again. And it can seem like, half a second, and to stay there for 3 seconds is so much effort that it seems fruitless. It seems like this is never going to get me anywhere. And the fact is that half a second after 2 or 3 weeks might turn into a second or two, and a second or two can then turn into 5 or 6 or 10 seconds, and then at some point it's like, I can rest here for 2 or 3 minutes. And if we can start dropping into being, just stopping, remembering often, to just be, to just stop, I am. And maybe that can happen 5 or 6 times in a day. And that's 5 or 6 more times than when we were never remembering I am. And so it really is a progressive movement that hopefully we can maybe see Especially as we start getting feeling the change, that's when it becomes easier and easier to trust, easier and easier to let go and allow the process to happen.
And just that the thinking mind has such a momentum that you just get dragged out of that little while or couple of seconds that you're there.
Mm-hmm.
I think with over time and probably this happening more often, I'll kind of make those muscles stronger, like you said.
Yeah. This momentum, as you said, what you described is just a impersonal dynamic. Actually, there is a strength to the thinking mind, and so there isn't you doing the thinking mind, but there is a strength to the thinking mind, and that strength is attachment to outcome and belief in personal doership. So we stop, and then the thinking mind says, no, you have to get somewhere and you have to make it happen. And so it drags us out of resting. It doesn't make any sense to the thinking mind. And with more and more experience of what a relief it is to just rest and be, and more experience of finding our true essence and finding a peace and a relief from struggle, that then starts to build up the momentum on the other side. And so I'm sure you've heard descriptions in some of the more traditional Indian teachings where they talk about your vasanas and samskaras, that they carry on after various realizations. They have to, what's the word? They have to use themselves up, essentially. And the analogy that's often used is the pulling the plug from a fan, and the fan has this momentum, so it continues to turn even once you've pulled the plug on it. So what you describe is not unusual.
Thank you so much, Roger.
You're welcome. Thank you for dropping in.